All right, today we're going to start week 2 of our study of music history. In our study of music history 4, this week is going to be Beethoven. Beethoven is going to be the most important or influential figure over the next 2 centuries in music. And Beethoven is the composer, as we talked about before, that is a transitional composer in that he begins in sort of this class in the style of classicism, and he moves towards or is pushing towards romanticism with really what's going to be happening in the 19th century. And a lot of this is going to be displayed really through his works from his middle or heroic style period on to the end of his life. Beethoven is one of the figures that we'll study that is almost, the myth surrounding him is almost more important than the music. So as we study Beethoven this week, and as you listen to some of the music examples, I want you to listen and think about him solely from a musical standpoint, and don't let this whole myth sway what your views are about Beethoven, or sway maybe give you a bias in a sense about Beethoven. So try to approach this as objectively as you possibly can, and listen to what's going on in the music, particularly as it progresses from for instance, the First Symphony through the Ninth Symphony. And I'll include some YouTube examples that you can kind of listen to, have up in the background as you're studying, so you can hear what the First Symphony, some sounds from the First Symphony, and compare that to the Third Symphony, the Eroica, which we'll talk about on Friday. That's part of our listening for this week, and is included in your anthology in your listening CDs. And then, of course, the Ninth Symphony, which we're familiar with, particularly the Ode to Joy from the fourth movement, the addition of soloist and chorus to the symphony, which we've talked about in reference to the choral fantasy, the Fantasia number 80. The Fantasia Opus number 80 that we listened to last Friday. But this week we're really going to try to explore this composer in depth. You must read the text. It's paramount that you do so, that you read the text that's in the content, and also your textbook, just to give you some good information, good background about Beethoven. What is, to me, is most interesting about Beethoven is this figure that is going to be sort of over the whole area of romanticism. It's Beethoven's ghost or spirit looms large over all of the 19th century, so much so that composers are compared to him constantly. As we see in Brahms, upon the completion and performance of his First Symphony, people called that the 10th Symphony. Beethoven composed 9 symphonies, and so obviously they're comparing Brahms' First Symphony, sort of, or putting it in that lineage of Beethoven. And what we see with Wagner is we actually see a composer who believed that nothing else could be done with instrumental music, that Beethoven took it as far as it could possibly be taken, that he did everything that could be done with it. And so a new style of music must emerge. And so with Wagner, we have the Gesamtkunstwerk, this total artwork which incorporates drama and poetry and things like that with music. So in Wagner, really pushing toward just something totally different in this element of programmatic music. Brahms obviously being someone who's way more conservative and being the absolutist of the bunch. So that's one of the things that really interests me about Beethoven, is why is this particular composer so important? Why is his spirit so big and large in the 19th century, in that every composer is compared to him? We're really going to see his influence felt more specifically in the early parts of the 19th century, really to about mid-century. We'll see this in the works of Chopin and with Berlioz, and even with Mendelssohn and Meyerbeer and Hummel. We're going to see sort of the direct influence of Beethoven in their music, particularly. Even Schumann, I'm sorry, I forgot to throw him in there as well. But we have Beethoven being more of a mythological character than an actual person. So we need to kind of separate the fact from the myth as we're progressing through this look into Beethoven's life. As we know that around 1801, Beethoven begins to realize that he's going deaf. And so it's with that acknowledgement of his deafness, and eventually the full onset of deafness, not being able to hear anything, that I believe and I feel really perpetuates this the myth of Beethoven more than the actual person, because he is really embodying the romantic ethos, this idea of the individual overcoming society, this individual overcoming all the circumstances of life, which, good grief, what is a greater example than that, of Beethoven overcoming deafness in order to write, some of the most stunning and compelling music that has ever been written. So those are some things to think about as you're reading through the stuff this week. Another thing something else that I want you to consider about Beethoven as well is the actual style periods themselves. His early style period, which is going to be all the way up until about 1803. Some even put it a little bit sooner as 1802, but 1802, 1803 is when we have the early period of when Beethoven is writing in sort of the style of classicism. And we're going to see this dramatic shift happen in his middle period, the heroic period, and it really is going to pivot upon the Eroica Symphony. That's really going to be the statement of the symphonic ideal as it has come to be known. And I'm actually going to include a little link there that'll kind of give you an idea of what that's about. So look forward to that in the reading this week. So the symphonic ideal, which is pivoting on Symphony Number 3. One of the differences we see in Mozart and with Beethoven is this idea of development. Mozart was the composer who churned out melody after melody after melody, just a continuous stream of one melody following another, a beautiful melody following a beautiful melody, and so on. Beethoven, however, is going to take a much different stance on the idea of composition, and it's really in the area of development. He is just a master of development, of melodic development. And so, as you're listening through Beethoven, as we discuss Beethoven on Wednesday and listen on Friday, I want you to pay close, particular attention to this idea of development, of him developing these melodic ideas and just going just way beyond what we could ever imagine. Lastly, in Symphony Number 3, the Eroica Symphony, there's a lot of interesting fact around that, a nice little story with Napoleon. But what we also see Beethoven doing in the Third Symphony is actually expanding the idea of the sonata form. Now, we've talked about sonata form as the movement, the first movement of a sonata or a symphony being in sonata allegro form. This idea where we have our exposition that's repeated, then we have our development section, and then our recapitulation. And I've kicked that dead horse enough that you guys, I think, are quite versed in that. So, but what we're going to see with Beethoven is actually him expanding this to a total work. So within a symphony, we're going to see this idea of exposition, of development, and of obviously sort of our recapitulation. So in a much broader form, the symphony is going to be expanded, the length, the instrumentation, the orchestra itself will be expanded, will grow in Beethoven's symphony. So, but we've got a lot to read this week. We've got a lot to watch and a lot to think about. So I want you to take this week. Remember, the ball is in your court this semester as far as the acquisition of material and reading and digesting, allowing this stuff to marinate. So I want you to jump in with both feet and just try to get your ears tuned into what's going on in Beethoven. And try to compare some things that are going on. I'll put an example of the First Symphony and the Ninth Symphony. And then you can compare that with the Third Symphony, which we have in our text. And then we'll have an example of the Sonata Pathétique, as well as to a later piano sonata. Now, Beethoven's piano sonatas, by the way, I know I'm kind of all over the page here with this video, but with this introductory video, but Beethoven's piano sonatas, by the way, are the New Testament. We call the Old Testament Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier. For the pianist, they study the Well-Tempered Clavier. That's the Old Testament. The New Testament is going to be what's going on with Beethoven's piano sonatas. So that's something else to sort of put into the mix of the study of Beethoven. So be ready for class on Wednesday for our discussion, and I look forward to a really good in-depth discussion about Beethoven, about his music, and about his life, and about his really his centrality to music for the next 200 years. So I'll see you on Wednesday. Thanks.